Where will we all be in 2030? Will we all be sealed up in our little bubbles? Or does mass media, as we used to know it, get a second lease of life or explore new ways to reach its audience? Let's take a quick look at the challenge.
Disruptive developments, calling for radical innovations. Digitization has sparked dynamic shifts that are changing our everyday lives. Do you want to understand how and why? Let's get to it.
The years go by and platforms, devices and user habits change. Let's look beyond the present. How will we use the media in the future? Media Use 2030.
Yes, consider this the grand finale of the Global Media Forum. We look into the crystal ball with experts and media players, both in one person. Let me just introduce our panel here. First of all, we have Jesper Daub. He's the Director of News Partnerships for Europe and beyond at Facebook. He comes from publishing, was CEO of Spiegel Online before joining Facebook, and is at the forefront of establishing Facebook's news platform here in Europe. We have Ambreen with us. Very pleased to have you all the way there from Pakistan. She's formerly a Senior Information Officer of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting and now the Director General of the Pakistan Broadcasting Corporation. In a country where less than half of people have direct access to the internet, we're about to hear from her what challenge that entails for ensuring people's right to information. And with me is Peter Limbourg, the Director General of Deutsche Welle, also my boss, of course. And you come from private broadcasting here in Germany as well. You're a seasoned correspondent, also from war zones, so you know both ends of this. But first of all, I would like to head back to our virtual feed to the Facebook director, Jesper Daub, here in Europe, because I had a look at the description of Facebook News and what kind of features you have. And your own information there says that today's stories are chosen by a team of journalists. You can personalize based on the news that I've clicked on before, I was interested in before and have shared and followed. There are news sections where I can limit what kind of sections of news and information I'm interested in. And there are controls to make sure people see the articles, topics or publishers they want to see and hide those that they don't. So doesn't that sound like I can seal up my news bubble until 2030?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's more complicated than that. I don't believe in the news bubbles as such, and I think there's evidence there from a lot of research in the past. But what this actually allows people is to be exposed to full breadth of news that they potentially could engage with. And just as with your old-fashioned newsstand, or when you choose to sign a subscription, there is choice that you make. And there are some press outlets that you might not like or just not want to engage with. And the personalization features on Facebook News will allow you to just choose what you're interested. So let's say on a very typical topic, people might not be into sports, so they can choose to switch off the sports element. People might not want to follow a brand. That's fine, they can choose not to. But what we're trying with this is to get more brands and more reliable news in front of people, and especially the ones that they might have not engaged with yet, to open up the choice to people and then let them make that choice.
But do you make an effort to show the other side of any story?
Yes, we are trying. We are at the very beginning of this, and the reason we have curation to a very certain and limited amount of stories is that we want to educate both the algorithmic section and the choice that we can surface both sides of the story. So you'll see when we curate stories for users, there's a clear rule set that looks for unbiased stories, or if there are many sides to the story, to allow for that to be seen by readers and users so that they can then make their own decisions on what they want to believe.
Ambreen, I'd like to head to you. Do you feel that Facebook, Google and the like are giving your parts of the world enough attention?
Yes, I think so they are. Like, for example, Radio Pakistan also has a footprint as far as Facebook is concerned. and Radio Pakistan itself has 2.5 million followers. So I think we have made a niche for ourselves in Facebook, and people are able to get as much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Acha. So we have already made a niche for ourselves in Facebook, and I think it is beneficial for both sides. Like we can find out for the listeners what is going on around the world. Even in the case of this pandemic, we saw that we were able to get the best practices that were available on Facebook. For example, like Pakistan is relatively a religious country. So we were able to find out what are the best practices that we can convince our people not to go out in the public and not to endanger their own lives. So I think Facebook is already there, and it's there in a big way.
But is it there in the way that you want it to be? We just heard in the previous panel from Professor Howard, they don't share the data. How important would that be for you?
Data is relevant for us, but as majority of our, there's a lot of illiteracy in Pakistan. So I think precise data is important, but our main focus is that we know what's going on in general around the world. So the connectivity that is being provided by Facebook is really relevant to us at this point in time.
Right, Peter Limbourg, Deutsche Welle is a global player. It also, of course, wants that data from users. What kind of cooperation would you prefer to have with Facebook in the future?
Basically, we have cooperations with Facebook, and it's fine, it's good. Yes, we want to have more data, how Facebook is putting their algorithm onto mankind. But this is, I would say, more a political question of democracy, who's controlling what. And I think if one of these platforms is so big, then they have to be transparent. We heard this the whole day. But this doesn't mean that we don't have good cooperations with Facebook. And I think it's increasingly developing. And but we would like to have to see Facebook more understanding why democracies want to have transparencies. And for instance, when we see now Facebook is owned by somebody who wants to make money, and it's fair enough, it's okay. But imagine Facebook would be owned by Xi Jinping or Mr. Putin. So what happens then with all the data? And so I would say it would be good if Facebook understands that it's also good for them to have more transparency in dealing with everybody.
We also heard from the German Publishers Group, also the head of the BBC Digital Services, who both admitted that working with social media allows them the kind of outreach they would normally never have as a news organization. At the same time, particularly the BBC wants to double down on establishing their own platform again, because they feel that the curation of news is very important. I just want to read you what Tim Snyder from Yale University said. He said, democracy means citizens who are used to being surprised, who hear the other side of the argument. Do you follow that kind of line?
I basically, Timothy Snyder, everything that he said today was brilliant, so I will follow him, yes. Concerning your own platform, I think it has to be a mix. I mean, you can't just rely on third platforms, but third platforms give you reach. And third platforms gave us also the possibility to reach millions of people. And we have now, for instance, last month, we have 1.3 billion reach on digital, and this comes from third platforms and from partners, not automatically from our own platform. And I think we have to follow both paths. We have to cooperate with the platforms, and also we have to strengthen our own platform, because when we look at the future also of linearity, there will be changes coming. And so we always have to make sure that a house like Deutsche Welle has its home where people can reach us, where they know where we are. So just being on third platforms wouldn't be good, but having our own strong platform is also necessary, yes.
Jesper Daub, you come from publishing. Where do you stand on looking at the future? Do you expect more fragmentation, more individual tailored news and information consumption, or is Facebook with its news outreach going a different route there as well?
Well, first of all, I think what doesn't change and what hasn't changed in the past is that it's about relevance. And it is about trust in a brand and making sure that people trust these journalists and this news outlet. If you look at Facebook, Facebook is not a news brand. What we do is we do not host the content, we distribute people out to the brands. So as Peter Limbourg rightly said, if someone clicks on a Deutsche Welle content piece, they end up on the own platform of Deutsche Welle. And I think this is important moving forward because we can only serve as a distribution mechanism. Now, whether there will be more individual use and more personalization is really hard to predict. But I think what is very clear is that there will be many, many more options for people to engage with a story. And journalism has always been about the story and not necessarily about the medium itself. And I think this is something that we see evolving. And you have other platforms like, for example, TikTok, where you have respectable media having great successes in reaching very young audiences. And I think this is what journalism is challenged by, is trying to embrace these new formats and still holding truth to their own beliefs in their own journalism and ensuring that their brand is still existent.
But how do you want to make sure that facts do get in the way of a good story?
Well, first of all, we do not write these stories. These are written by our partners, the media brands, the news outlets across the world, or produced in video. What we are doing as an example to uplift news and journalistic content is the introduction of a surface like Facebook News, making sure that this is a surface where only vetted partners can actually be seen and chosen by the audience, as one of the many examples on how to uplift journalism.
I would like to bring in one of our Global Media Forum fellows now and like her to ask a question to Ambreen Jan. Let's just take a look at what she has to say.
Hello, my name is Deutsche. I'm representing the Nest Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development in Mongolia. So as we're discussing the changes in the coming 10 years, how do you see the changes that we're discussing today playing out in developing countries like Mongolia, where media literacy is low, digital literacy is low, and information accessibility is a problem? And how do you suggest the media navigate in this environment in order to stay in business while ensuring the public's right to information?
Ambreen Jan, your chance to also make some recommendations to Facebook and Deutsche Welle.
Yes, like in Pakistan, what we are trying to do, or in the developing world, I think countries are trying to take into account and use cross-media platforms. So for example, on the face of it, the rate of literacy in Pakistan is not as high as in the developing world, but access to internet and the percentage of people using the internet and the social media is higher than any person would expect. Even maids who are working in houses, they have a Facebook account and they are accessing the data that's available there. Recently also in Pakistan, our minister asked Radio Pakistan to launch its podcast. So this is something that we have recently launched, and we are there on Apple, Google, on iTunes. So we are trying to become relevant in a changing environment. And I think I have discovered, especially during this pandemic, that the relevance of the radio broadcasting has increased. It is not decreased. In poor countries or in areas, for example, far-flung areas where people don't have electricity, they don't have internet, they can have a radio transistor, and they can just use 2 transistor battery cells, and they can through that or through their colleagues have access to Facebook, for example, in universities which have these facilities. People do have constant access to Facebook and Google and all these platforms.
Peter Limbourg, Pakistan is one of those regions where everybody actually on the street knows who Deutsche Welle is because it has such an impact there. Deutsche Welle is in all regions in the world. What do you feel is the greatest challenge for an institution like Deutsche Welle, particularly in societies that are not easily connected?
Oh, well, it's all about coming to our users. And in some regions, it's very difficult because we are getting disturbed, or people like to block us or even censor us. So this is one challenge which is always there. China is a bad example, and Iran too. But also in other countries, we have difficulties to bring in our content. And distribution is important. And let me just talk to Jasper, because one thing I have my doubts on is that Facebook is just a distributor. I mean, everybody should be responsible for what is on his own platform. So if Deutsche Welle has hate speech on its platform, we're responsible for it and we have to fight it. So I think also Facebook and other platforms should do this. And if they don't do it on their own, then they have to be regulated, like we are also regulated, and every network is regulated in every country. So this is just a sidekick, and on the other hand, it's reaching the people with the classical journalism is also a challenge, because there is so much out there, like influencers, and they're not all as good as Philip Neto we just heard. There are also others. So we have to compete with new competitors. This is so. But I can talk the whole day about challenges. So I think I stop here now.
Yeah, but I'll take this to Jasper, please, because we also had someone who has 37 million followers on Facebook, Nasser Yassin, on today. And he gave advice to my colleague Max Hoffmann on how to be more successful. And he said they've built social media in a way that bias gets you success. Now, if someone who has 37 million followers gives you that kind of advice, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think it depends on what you are trying to achieve. And I think we cannot confuse an influencer with a journalist and a news outlet. If you're doing marketing, I think it's a very old trick to excite people and polarize, and even pulling off scandals at times to get attention to your brand.
How do you differentiate between opinion and journalism on your platform then?
Well, it depends if it is opinion from a private person or someone who represents journalism or a journalistic brand, I think is important. And this is probably more than just us, because if you look at the development of journalism, especially over the past years, coming out of the US with the cable networks and the change from factual reporting over to more opinionated pieces as a potential success for journalism, this is what personally worries me. When we look at criteria for access to Facebook News, it adheres to the typical classical good standards of journalistic work. And this is where I would draw the line. Does my crazy Uncle Paul have opinions? Yes. Should he be allowed to have that? Yes. The question is who he represents, whether it's himself or whether he tries to change something.
But talking about that uncle, Donald Trump is still banned till 2023 from social media. What's your prediction? Will that continue past that point?
Well, I am not in a position to make that decision. And I think it is very healthy that we have a body that advises Facebook in absence of regulation for these things, which is called the Oversight Board. We work closely with them. They are a board of independent people representing a broad slate of skill sets, cultures, nationalities, and different backgrounds. So we put a lot of effort in setting up and helping them to evolve over time. But I think this is a very good example. We are talking about a lot of regulation, and I think we need regulation. There's no doubt about this. We welcome regulation. And I think a good example of that is what is happening in the EU, where there's a lot of debate and healthy debate around what can be said and what cannot be said online through the Digital Services Act, and how to actually deal with that. It is complex. I think it's good that we're having this dialogue now.
Well, in fact, Ambreen, I'll take that to you. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has said in the past that she sees the EU as potentially becoming an exporter of regulation, particularly on those issues. What kind of expectation do you have there? Is that something that you have in your debating when politicians talk about regulation?
Recently, in my ministry, in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, we ourselves were debating that we don't have any media policy. So this is something that is not in black and white in Pakistan. And there is at times a lot of irresponsibility that's there on the part of people who are basically pretending to be independent, but they naturally are reflecting or standing for different interest groups. So the ministry is trying really hard to fill this gap and to have a media policy, but understandably so, there is a lot of resistance from media also, because there are certain points of conflict. For example, the media wants to know who is going to define patriotism, who is going to define nationalism, and who would be responsible, who can say that he is a person, who would be the person who would cast the first stone. So we are still in the stage of deciding as to what rules and regulations to make, because the media always slips out of this responsibility by saying that they are going to regulate themselves, but that never happens. And whenever the government tries to fill in the gap, they resist that also. So I hope that wherever, in whichever part of the world rules and regulations are made, they are made with fairness in mind, relative fairness. There can't be 100% fairness, but there should be relative fairness at least.
Peter Limbourg, I just want to put something to you that how Philip Justus, the vice president of Google in Europe, put the relationship with platforms, with other broadcasters. He said that that relationship is complicated. How would you describe it?
Yes, he's right. I mean, he's...
in which ways? Yeah.
Well, I think I already stressed some of the points. It's about who's responsible for what. Then you have the question of, for instance, private companies. They suffer because of the big platforms are so big and they're taking so much commercial money. And we also heard Timothy Snyder. He said that local journalism can barely exist because of the big platforms taking all the money. So, I mean, it's complicated, but it doesn't help us if we fight each other. I think we saw some good examples also with Facebook News and also Google News. There are corporations, and I think it's important that we get back a sort of control from what people produce is also for them to commercialize. And I'm lucky because I'm speaking as a CEO of a public broadcaster, and so we don't have to earn our money on the market. If we would have, it would be very difficult, because Facebook and Google is taking a lot of money. And fine with them. I mean, they're there they're not here to make the world better. They're here to make money, which is fair enough. And if they make the world a bit better, fine, good. But it is really difficult that a lot of companies don't have any money left to invest or to bring in their own journalistic, especially local content.
Jesper Dubb, we actually had an academic here on the Global Media Forum as well who said that the emergence of local newspapers once again, that would be real disruption, that the status quo is that there are large voids now being created with such a domination of social media companies and few outlets remaining. Can you give us a prediction to 2030, where we will be on that? Do you expect, you say that the brands matter, but do you expect that there could be, once again, more diversity, or do you believe that we're currently in a race where a few news and information brands will remain?
Well, I think making predictions is always risky when you look 9 years ahead. If you look 9 years back, that was probably a time where I had an iPhone 4 and could not envision that people would be watching Netflix on a mobile device which they are today.
9 months then?
I'd give I think there is a chance. We are seeing really concerning developments in the US, very much so, where we have news deserts, where there is no coverage of any local newsrooms of these communities anymore. We see the same in the UK, where we are running a project together with local news to strengthen these communities again and allow them to employ reporters to cover it. What we see, though, is that there is a huge interest in local news. People want to know what is going on in their neighborhoods and in their surroundings. So I think there is a demand. The question is just, how does that transformation work, since there's so much pressure on the industry, especially the small ones? And this is what we are trying to find out with partners, and what role we can play there, because we might have a good access to these audiences. And how could newsrooms, small newsrooms and outlets potentially leverage that to make it a success? But it is a long shot, and the current situation is dire.
I would like to ask you all, starting with Ambreen Jan, a final question. What would be your word of advice for journalists in the face of these upheavals? Obviously, I'm asking for a friend.
I think the main challenge is that we must try and focus on our job, which is to work in an honest manner and to give our opinion, but the opinion should not be tilted completely. For example, we are a state broadcaster, and our minister asked us to get the feedback for our podcast, for the launching of our podcast, from a professor. And the first thing he told us was that please do not bore your audience by asking the ministers who have nothing to do with your material. As a state broadcaster, don't lose the space that you can win. So I think that even as a state broadcaster, we have this responsibility of giving out news and stories that are relevant to the people. And I also would like to share here that as far as profit making is concerned, Radio Pakistan has stations all across Pakistan. The private FM stations, they are in centers in metropolitan cities. But for example, Pakistan Broadcasting Corporation has a station in Loralai, in the most remotest areas. And the government expects us to make profit also, but we are not there to make profit. So I think it's easier for us to say what is not profit making, but basically is there to boost the nation and to create unity inside and outside the world.
Just Vidal, what is your recommendation for journalists who, of course, also want to make it on Facebook?
Well, whether it's Facebook or not, I think the advice is stay true to your core job and don't try to game the systems for short-term success. So I think the most obvious one that we've seen over the past years was clickbaiting to just drive traffic, but this actually devalues your brand and your work. And then with that comes the embracing of change and opportunities. I've been in the industry before I joined Facebook for 20 years. And whenever there was something new, people were skeptic, they were frowning. Instead of embracing it and trying it out, I think we've seen huge successes. Who would have thought that audio would have a renaissance in podcasts? Who would have thought that the new development that we're seeing on the newsletter boom would be something that people would start reading emails again to consume newsletters? So I think there needs to be an openness from journalists to follow these developments and be brave and try things out, but without giving away their core beliefs and their core values.
Peter.
Yeah, I agree with Jesper, and I think journalists must be open for new technologies, must be interested in new technologies, and they should never forget that they're journalists and not activists. Because I think this is something where we can see the internet is full of activists. And there is so much attitude in every corner of the internet, on every social media platform. We don't have a lack of this. We have sometimes a lack of good explained classical journalism. And this is what we're here for. And so this we should do and keep on doing.
Okay, well, thank you to all three of you. Plenty of advice there. And the real test will be on social media and beyond until 2030. We'll meet here again before that, I trust.